Have you ever seen someone clearly incompetent get promoted? Once again, that person everyone knows makes bad decisions, creates problems others have to fix, and still keeps moving up the hierarchy. Meanwhile, someone far more capable stays in the same position, working behind the scenes, almost invisible. If this situation has ever made you wonder how this keeps happening, you're not alone. This kind of experience feels so common that many people start believing there must be some mysterious injustice behind it. But what makes this situation truly intriguing is that this pattern didn't appear yesterday. More than 500 years ago, a thinker was observing exactly the same phenomenon in governments, political courts, and structures of power. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. Unlike many philosophers who spoke about how leaders should behave in an ideal world, Machiavelli was interested in something much more direct. He wanted to understand how power actually works in the real world. Not how we wish it worked, but how it truly behaves when ambitious people compete for influence, authority, and control. And what he discovered may feel a little uncomfortable at first. In many contexts, the least prepared individuals don't reach the top by accident. Often, they end up having certain advantages within the very structures of power themselves. Not because there is necessarily an organized conspiracy, but because human systems tend to reward specific types of behavior. In this video, we're going to explore 3 surprisingly simple mechanisms that help explain why overly confident people, even when they aren't the most competent, manage to rise so high. And if you enjoy reflections like this, it's a great moment to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Now, the first thing we need to understand is why, in so many environments, confidence often seems far more convincing than real competence. There is a curious pattern that appears in almost every human environment, from workplace meetings to public debates. The person who speaks with more certainty almost always seems more convincing than the one who speaks with caution, even when they don't truly know what they're talking about. Something in a firm tone of voice, direct sentences, and the absence of doubt creates an immediate impression of authority that often completely misleads those who are listening. Now think about the last time you watched a discussion about a complex problem. On one side, someone said the situation required careful analysis, several factors, and possible risks. On the other, someone confidently stated that the solution was simple and obvious. Curiously, for most people, the second answer feels stronger, not because it is more correct, but because it sounds more certain. Here is the first piece of this puzzle. Truly intelligent people tend to perceive the complexity of things. When they understand a problem, they also see its limitations, hidden variables, and unexpected consequences. That is why they speak more carefully. They use words like maybe, we need to test, it depends. This is not weakness. It is awareness that reality is rarely simple. Less perceptive people, on the other hand, live in a much simpler world inside their own minds. For them, complex problems seem easy because many factors are simply not noticed. If you cannot see the risks, you naturally speak with absolute certainty. And that certainty creates a powerful illusion. Those who listen begin to confuse conviction with competence. This phenomenon appears constantly in professional environments. Imagine 2 people in a meeting. One says, "We need to analyze this better before deciding. There are variables we still don't understand." The other immediately replies, "Leave it to me, this is already solved." Curiously, the second person often seems more prepared, even when the first is being far more responsible. In public debates, the pattern becomes even clearer. A true expert usually explains that there are several possible scenarios, incomplete data, and side effects that are difficult to predict. In contrast, someone with a superficial understanding offers a simple, direct answer full of confidence. For an audience tired of complexity, the second response feels irresistibly convincing. Machiavelli noticed this dynamic long before modern psychology. He observed that in politics, appearance often weighs more than reality. Most people do not have the time, knowledge, or access to information necessary to evaluate real competence. So they do something the human brain loves to do. They use mental shortcuts. One of those shortcuts is extremely powerful. When someone shows absolute certainty, our brain interprets it as a signal of authority. From an evolutionary perspective, it made sense to follow those who appeared decisive. In primitive environments, hesitant leaders could mean danger. But in a complex world, that same instinct can lead us to trust the wrong people. This is exactly the ground where empty confidence begins to defeat real competence. Those who speak with nuance seem insecure. Those who speak with simplicity seem strong. Those who admit doubts seem weak. Those who promise definitive answers seem like leaders. Few people realize that true understanding usually comes with questions, not certainties. There is also another important detail. More intelligent people often feel responsible for the consequences of what they say. They know that wrong decisions can create serious problems. That naturally creates caution. Those who fail to perceive these risks speak with complete freedom because they simply do not see the scale of the possible mistakes. Over time, this difference creates a curious advantage. The cautious person appears slow, while the confident person appears decisive. The reflective person seems complicated, while the simplistic one seems practical. And in environments where fast decisions and strong speeches are valued, the appearance of certainty begins to be rewarded. This explains why so many organizations end up elevating the most confident voices, not necessarily the most capable ones. The human evaluation system rarely measures depth of thinking. It measures impression. Those who transmit certainty gain credibility. Those who transmit reflection create doubt, even when the reality is exactly the opposite. Machiavelli summarized this human fragility in an almost uncomfortable way. Most people judge more by what they see than by what they truly understand. Few have access to someone's real ability. Everyone, however, can perceive posture, tone, and confidence. And when judgment is based on appearance, appearance begins to dominate. But this distortion of perception is only the beginning of the story. Because when entire systems start confusing appearance with capability, something even more curious begins to happen within the structures of power themselves. Little by little, the people who actually see problems start to be perceived not as useful, but as dangerous. When we begin to observe more closely how power structures actually function, something curious appears. Many organizations claim to value intelligence, innovation, and critical thinking. In theory, these qualities seem essential. But in daily practice, what often gets rewarded is not the person who clearly sees problems, but the one who keeps the environment comfortable for those already at the top of the hierarchy. This happens because every system of power has a silent objective that is rarely declared openly: preserving stability. Deep changes create risk, expose past mistakes, and force people in high positions to admit that certain decisions were wrong. Naturally, those who occupy these positions tend to prefer individuals who keep everything running without raising uncomfortable questions. More perceptive people usually have a trait that may seem valuable in theory, but dangerous in practice. They ask questions. They challenge outdated processes, point out inconsistencies, and suggest improvements. They do not do this out of rebellion, but because they notice patterns others ignore. However, for those who built or manage the current system, these observations can sound like direct criticism. Imagine a typical meeting inside a company. Someone raises their hand and says that a certain procedure is causing losses or wasting resources. From a rational perspective, this should be received as a contribution. But many times the opposite happens. The comment creates discomfort because recognizing the problem implies admitting that something important was poorly planned. Now compare that with another very common behavior. Instead of questioning, someone simply agrees with everything that has been said. They reinforce the manager's ideas, praise the current strategy, and promise to execute exactly what was requested. This person rarely creates tension. They appear cooperative, predictable, and easy to manage. In hierarchical environments, that can seem extremely valuable. Over time, this pattern shapes who rises and who remains invisible. Those who point out flaws start to be seen as difficult. Those who agree with everything start to be seen as reliable. The difference is rarely described this way, of course. Instead, elegant corporate labels appear that disguise the real reason behind exclusion or promotion. Meanwhile, individuals who maintain the functioning of the system without questioning it begin to seem ideal for intermediate leadership roles. They do not create conflict, they do not challenge higher decisions, and they do not generate uncomfortable situations in meetings. For those at the top, this predictability can feel like a form of security. In politics, the dynamic is surprisingly similar. Candidates who acknowledge complexity usually explain that certain problems require long-term planning, cooperation, and gradual solutions. Meanwhile, candidates who promise quick and simple answers project an image of strength. Even when those promises are unrealistic, they sound far more comforting to those listening. The result is an environment where truth often becomes inconvenient. Those who express it may be seen as people who complicate things. Meanwhile, those who oversimplify reality begin to appear decisive. Not because they truly solve problems, but because they avoid confronting the system's fragilities. Machiavelli noticed something similar while observing governments and political courts of his time. Rulers often preferred advisors who reinforced their decisions rather than those who presented uncomfortable analyses. Pleasant advice was rewarded. Honest advice was often ignored or even punished. This mechanism creates a silent selection process inside organizations. No one needs to openly declare that critical intelligence is unwelcome. It is enough to consistently reward those who keep everything stable and ignore those who try to improve the system. Over time, people quickly learn which behavior leads to advancement in the hierarchy. You may have already witnessed something like this firsthand. That person who constantly identifies important problems ends up being seen as difficult to deal with. Meanwhile, someone who simply repeats leadership ideas rises quickly through the ranks. If something like this has ever happened in your workplace or field, share in the comments what that experience was like. Because when systems begin to favor those who do not threaten the existing structure, an inevitable consequence slowly appears. Truly competent individuals start to seem dangerous, and leaders who reach the top within that environment begin to feel something even more unsettling: the constant fear of being surpassed by someone more capable. And it is exactly at this point that the dynamic becomes even more delicate. Once insecurity enters the equation, the choices of those in power start to follow a different logic. Instead of searching for talent to strengthen the system, many begin to look for something far safer for themselves: people who will never represent a threat. When an insecure person finally reaches a position of power, something subtle begins to happen within the structure around them. At first, almost no one notices. The new leadership speaks about efficiency, collaboration, and growth, exactly as any other leader would. But behind those words, there is a silent concern that starts to influence every important decision. This concern is rarely admitted, not even to oneself. Deep down, many insecure leaders know they did not reach the top purely through extraordinary competence. Perhaps they benefited from favorable circumstances, strong connections, or simply from a system that values appearance more than real capability. This silent doubt creates a constant anxiety, and when that anxiety appears, it begins shaping critical choices, especially when selecting people to work nearby. Every new talent hired represents two very different possibilities. It can strengthen the organization, but it can also expose weaknesses in leadership. For someone confident, that is positive. For someone insecure, it feels like a risk. Imagine a manager who notices the arrival of an extremely competent professional. someone who quickly sees problems and proposes intelligent solutions. In theory, this type of person should be valued. But if their presence threatens to reveal flawed decisions or a lack of preparation in leadership, the reaction may be far less welcoming than expected. This is where a pattern recognized by many organizational psychologists begins to appear. Insecure leaders tend to prefer collaborators who do not challenge their decisions, people who execute orders without questioning, who rarely disagree, and who reinforce the leader's sense of authority. Not because these individuals are necessarily bad professionals, but because they seem safe. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in the quality of teams. Instead of searching for the most capable individuals available, leadership begins to prefer those who appear more loyal, more predictable, and less threatening. Competence continues to be mentioned in speeches, but the real selection starts including another silent criterion: personal security. Now imagine this same process repeating across multiple levels of an organization. An insecure leader chooses subordinates who do not challenge them. Those subordinates, once promoted, do exactly the same thing. Each layer begins selecting people who are slightly less critical, slightly less questioning, and often slightly less competent. This phenomenon creates what some researchers call a cascade of incompetence. At the top, someone avoids talents who might compete. At the level below, managers do the same to protect their own positions. Little by little, the entire structure starts shaping itself not around excellence, but around self-preservation. Before long, the organization still appears functional on the surface. Reports continue to be produced, meetings continue to happen, and goals continue to be announced. However, the real capacity to solve problems begins to weaken. Decisions start circulating within an increasingly homogeneous group where few feel comfortable disagreeing. This environment creates another curious effect. Any criticism begins to be interpreted as a personal threat. Instead of being treated as an attempt to improve processes, a more direct observation may be seen as a challenge to authority. As a result, real problems stop being discussed openly and begin to be avoided or softened. When criticism stops being welcome, something even more concerning emerges. Organizations begin investing more energy in protecting their image than in fixing their failures. Presentations become more polished, reports appear more optimistic, and speeches grow more convincing. But behind that organized appearance, problems continue to grow. This contrast between appearance and reality is exactly what Machiavelli observed in many structures of power. Governments, courts, and institutions often became specialists in appearing strong, even while their real capability was deteriorating. The theater of competence slowly replaced true competence. Perhaps you have noticed something similar somewhere you worked. An environment where raising problems creates immediate discomfort, while repeating the official narrative is always well received. If any experience like that has caught your attention during your career, it might be worth sharing in the comments what you observed. What makes this even more interesting is that the process rarely happens through deliberate planning. No one gathers in a room and decides that the organization will become less competent. Everything happens through small individual decisions, motivated by fear, self-preservation, and the human need to protect one's position. And when those decisions accumulate over time, the result is a structure that continues functioning in appearance, but gradually loses its capacity to adapt. Complex problems start to seem increasingly difficult to solve, not because they are impossible, but because the voices capable of confronting them are missing. In the end, the organization becomes extremely efficient at maintaining the impression of order and control, while its real ability to understand and solve challenges slowly declines. And it is exactly at this point that the most interesting question begins to emerge. If these patterns have existed for centuries, why do we keep falling into them again and again? Throughout this reflection, we begin to realize that the problem is not only the people who reach power, but the silent mechanisms that help place them there. Apparent confidence often defeats real competence. Systems prefer those who do not threaten their stability. And when insecure leaders reach the top, the entire structure can begin to shape itself around self-preservation instead of capability. Machiavelli did not write about these dynamics to glorify them, but to reveal them. He believed that understanding how power truly works was the only way to avoid being deceived by it. When we learn to recognize these patterns, we start seeing beyond appearances, noticing when authority comes from real ability, and when it is merely a construction of image. Perhaps now you will begin to notice these signals in places where everything once seemed normal. In companies, in organizations, in politics, or even in small, everyday groups. And that raises an interesting question. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone clearly less prepared ended up taking leadership while far more capable people were left behind? If any experience like that came to mind, share it in the comments. And if this reflection made sense to you, it's worth supporting the channel by leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next discussions. Because understanding how these dynamics work does not mean accepting that they are inevitable. Often, the first step to changing a system is simply learning to see it more clearly.